The date was October 12th, 1952. The Coconut Grove nightclub in Los Angeles was packed. Every table was full. Every seat was taken. Standing room only. The venue was legendary, a place where the biggest stars in Hollywood came to see and be seen. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. The smell of expensive perfume and cognac filled the room. On stage, Dean Martin was in the middle of his act. He was 35 years old, still relatively unknown to mainstream America, but those in the know understood they were watching something special. Dean had that rare quality that couldn't be taught. He had presence. He had charm. He had a voice that made you believe every word he sang. But more than anything, he had an ability to read a room, to sense the energy of an audience, and to give them exactly what they needed in that moment. Dean was halfway through a song called That's Amore when he noticed something peculiar. In the back corner of the nightclub, a man stood up. This wasn't unusual in itself. People stood up all the time at the Coconut Grove. They danced, they moved around, they went to the bar. But this man was different. He was standing completely still, and he was staring directly at Dean Martin with an intensity that cut through the noise and chaos of the room. Dean's eyes locked onto him for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Something about this stranger felt different. Something about the way he was looking at Dean Martin sent a chill down the performer's spine. Dean was a professional. He'd been performing since he was a teenager. He'd learned to push through distractions, to keep the show going no matter what was happening around him. So he continued singing. His voice never wavered. His movements remained fluid and natural, but internally, Dean Martin was alert. He was watching the stranger, trying to figure out who he was and why he was looking at him that way. The stranger didn't move. He didn't sit back down. He didn't take his eyes off Dean. He just stood there in the darkness of the back corner, staring with an expression that Dean couldn't quite read from the stage lights. As Dean finished the song and moved into his comedy routine, the stranger remained standing. Dean made jokes. He did impressions. He interacted with the audience, pointing at people, making them laugh, making them feel like they were part of something special. But the whole time, he was acutely aware of the man in the back. The man who wouldn't sit down. The man who wouldn't look away. Other people in the audience were starting to notice it too. A woman at a nearby table kept glancing back at the stranger. A waiter paused with his tray, curious about why this man was just standing there, motionless. Dean's mind was racing through possibilities. Was this man dangerous? Was he a critic? A rival? Someone from his past? Dean had made enemies over the years. He'd dated women whose boyfriends didn't appreciate it. He'd performed at venues where the wrong people took notice of him. He'd lived a life that, while glamorous on the surface, had its share of complications underneath. But as Dean continued his act, he noticed something else about the stranger. The man's eyes weren't angry. They weren't hostile. If anything, they seemed almost sad, almost searching. Like he was looking for something in Dean Martin's face, something he hoped to find, but wasn't sure he would. By the end of Dean's set, the stranger was still standing. The audience gave Dean a standing ovation. People cheered and whistled and applauded. Dean took his bows, smiled at the crowd, and waved. And then, instead of exiting stage left as he usually did, Dean did something unexpected. He pointed directly at the stranger in the back corner and said into the microphone, "You in the back. The guy standing. Yeah, you. Come on up here for a minute." The entire room went quiet. People turned around to look at the stranger. The stranger's eyes went wide. He looked shocked, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't have been doing. The man hesitated. He didn't move. Dean repeated his invitation. "Come on, don't be shy. I don't bite. Well, not usually anyway." The audience laughed nervously. Still, the stranger didn't move. Dean stepped to the edge of the stage and leaned forward. "What's your name, pal?" The stranger, realizing he had no choice but to respond, called out in a voice that was slightly hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in a while. "It's Frank." Dean smiled. "Frank. Well, Frank, how about you come up here and tell this nice audience what you think about the show?" Frank shook his head slowly. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture of refusal. But Dean wasn't going to take no for an answer. "Frank," Dean said, his tone becoming more serious, more genuine, "I noticed you watching me pretty intently through that whole performance. And I gotta say, you made me curious. You made me wonder what was going on in that head of yours. So, I'm gonna ask you nicely one more time. Why don't you come up here and tell us what's on your mind? Frank looked around the room. Everyone was staring at him now. Some people were smiling, thinking this was part of Dean's act, a setup for a joke. Some people looked genuinely uncomfortable, like they were witnessing something private that shouldn't be public. Frank took a deep breath. Then slowly, he started making his way through the crowd toward the stage. When Frank reached the stairs that led up to the stage, Dean could see him more clearly. Frank was an older man, probably in his 60s. He had gray hair, a weathered face, and eyes that had seen a lot of life. There was something familiar about him, something that nagged at Dean, but he couldn't place it. Frank climbed the stairs slowly, as if each step was difficult. When he reached the stage, Dean shook his hand firmly and looked him in the eyes. "Thanks for coming up, Frank. That took guts." Frank nodded but didn't speak. Dean turned to the audience. "So Frank here has been watching me all night with the most intense stare I've ever seen. Frank, what gives? What were you thinking about?" Frank opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. He cleared his throat. His hands were shaking slightly. "I'm sorry," Frank finally said, his voice quiet but carrying through the room. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's just, I had to see you. I had to see if you were real." Dean's expression changed. He sensed that this wasn't a simple encounter. There was something deeper going on here. "What do you mean? You had to see if I was real? Do I look like a ghost?" The audience laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. Dean's tone had shifted. He wasn't doing comedy anymore. He was genuinely curious. He wanted to understand this man. "My name is Frank Crocetti," the stranger said. The room went completely silent. Dean's face went pale. Crocetti was Dean Martin's real last name. His father's name was Gaetano Crocetti. Dean Martin was a stage name, something he'd adopted to make it an entertainment. But very few people outside his family knew his real name. "I'm your cousin," Frank continued. "Your father's brother's son. We haven't seen each other in almost 20 years, not since we were kids. I didn't even know if you'd still be alive, or if you'd remember me, or I just had to come. When I heard you were performing here, I had to come see you." Dean's legs felt weak. He grabbed onto the microphone stand to steady himself. His cousin. He hadn't thought about that side of his family in years. They'd been estranged, spread out across the country. His father had come to America from Italy and had worked hard to build a life, but family ties had frayed over time and distance. "Frank," Dean said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know what to say." Frank smiled, and there were tears in his eyes. "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted to see you. I wanted to know you turned out okay. Our family, we're not always good at staying connected, but when I heard that Dino Crocetti had become Dean Martin, that you were making it in Hollywood, I had to see it for myself. I had to see if my little cousin had really made it." Dean pulled Frank into an embrace. The audience, now understanding what was happening, began to applaud. It wasn't the usual applause. It was the kind of applause that came from the heart, from people who understood they were witnessing something genuine, something real. When Dean and Frank separated, Dean turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes life throws you a curveball right when you least expect it. Sometimes the universe reminds you of who you are and where you come from. This is my cousin Frank, and I haven't seen him in almost 20 years. Frank, would you like to tell everyone a story? Any story? About me, about our family, about anything?" Frank laughed. It was a warm laugh, the laugh of someone who was experiencing a moment of pure joy. "You want me to tell a story? On stage? In front of all these people?" "Why not?" Dean said. "You've got my attention. You've got everyone's attention. The stage is yours." Frank stepped closer to the microphone. He was nervous. His hands were still shaking. But he began to speak. "I remember when Dean was maybe 8 years old," Frank started, "and his father, my uncle Gaetano, he brought Dean to visit our family in Ohio. We were living in a little house, nothing fancy, but we were together, you know. Family was everything." Frank paused, remembering. Dean was this skinny kid, and he was always singing, always. He'd sing while he ate, he'd sing while he played, he'd sing while he did his chores. And my father, he'd tell Dean to be quiet, to focus on what he was doing. But I remember thinking, even back then, that there was something special about that kid. There was a light in him, a joy that nothing could take away. And I remember thinking, that kid's gonna do something big someday. That kid's gonna be somebody. Dean's eyes were wet with tears now. The entire room was silent, hanging on every word Frank said. And then we got separated, Frank continued. Families moved, people lost touch. And I thought about that kid, about my cousin from time to time, wondered what happened to him. And then, a few months ago, I heard on the radio that Dean Martin was performing at the Coconut Grove. And I thought, could that be the same kid? Could it be? So, I came tonight to find out. And the minute I saw you on that stage, I knew it was you. I knew it was my cousin, and all those years just disappeared. I was that kid again, watching you sing, knowing that you were meant for something special. When Frank finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People were openly crying. The applause that followed was thunderous. Dean hugged his cousin again, and this time he didn't let go right away. When they finally separated, Dean said to Frank, "You need to sit down. You need to stay. We're going to talk after the show. We're going to catch up. We're going to get reacquainted. We're going to do this right." Frank nodded, unable to speak through his emotions. Dean helped him down from the stage and found him a seat at a table near the front, with a clear view of the stage. For the rest of the show, Dean's performance was different. It was lighter, more joyful, more alive. He kept looking over at Frank, making eye contact, smiling. He played new songs, told new jokes, but there was an undercurrent of warmth to everything he did. It was like reuniting with his cousin had reignited something inside him, a connection to his roots, to who he really was beneath the stage name and the Hollywood persona. When the show ended and Dean had taken his final bows, he didn't disappear backstage. Instead, he came down into the audience and walked directly to Frank's table. "Come on," Dean said, extending his hand. "Let's get out of here. Let's go somewhere we can talk properly." Frank took his hand, and they walked out of the Coconut Grove together. They went to a small diner a few blocks away, the kind of place where nobody paid attention to who came in or out. They sat in a booth in the back, and for the next 6 hours, they talked. Frank told Dean about their family, about the relatives Dean hadn't seen since childhood, about the lives people had lived, the successes and the failures and the struggles. Frank told Dean about his own life, how he'd become an accountant, how he'd married and had children, how he'd always wanted to reconnect with Dean but hadn't known how. Dean, for his part, told Frank about his life. He talked about the struggles of breaking into entertainment, about the people who'd helped him along the way, about the sacrifices he'd made to build the career he was building. He talked about Jerry Lewis, the young comedian he'd recently started working with, and the comedy act they were developing together. He talked about how lonely it could be sometimes, how sometimes he felt like he'd left so much of himself behind in pursuit of a dream. "I changed my name," Dean said at one point. "I became someone else, and sometimes I wonder who I left behind. And now you're here, reminding me of exactly who that person was." As the sun began to rise on the morning of October 13th, Dean and Frank sat in that diner, and Dean said something that would stay with Frank for the rest of his life. "You know what you did last night? By standing up, by staring at me, by forcing me to notice you? You reminded me of something important. You reminded me that success isn't about leaving your past behind. It's about bringing your past with you into your future. It's about staying connected to the people who knew you before you became someone else." From that night forward, Dean Martin made a conscious effort to stay in touch with his cousin Frank and with the rest of his family. He learned to balance his life in Hollywood with his roots in America's Italian-American communities. He understood that the stage name and the persona were tools. But underneath it all, he was still Dino Crocetti, the son of Gaetano, the cousin of Frank, the member of a family that had come to America seeking a better life. That encounter at the Coconut Grove became a turning point for Dean Martin, though few people outside his family ever knew about it. Years later, when Dean was being interviewed by a journalist, he was asked about the moment that changed his perspective on his career. Dean didn't mention the encounter with Frank directly, but he alluded to it. I think the moment I really understood what I was doing was when I realized that my success wasn't just about me, Dean said. It was about representing something. It was about making my family proud. It was about showing them that a kid from Steubenville, Ohio, whose father came from Sicily, could make it in America. Not by forgetting where he came from, but by bringing that legacy with him every single day onto the stage. The story of that night at the Coconut Grove, when a stranger stood up and turned out to be Dean Martin's cousin, is a story about connection. It's a story about how sometimes the universe puts people in our path at exactly the right moment. It's a story about the power of family, about the importance of staying connected to your roots even as you pursue your dreams. It's a story that reminds us that behind every successful person is a history, a past, a family that shaped them into who they became. Dean Martin went on to become one of the biggest stars in Hollywood history. He became an actor, a singer, a comedian, a television host. He worked with Jerry Lewis to create comedy that would influence generations. He performed with Frank Sinatra and became part of the legendary Rat Pack. He became the definition of cool, the embodiment of Hollywood's golden age. But none of that would have been possible if he'd forgotten where he came from. And on that October night in 1952, when his cousin Frank stood up and forced Dean to see him, Dean was reminded of that essential truth. Frank became a regular part of Dean Martin's life after that night. He would visit Hollywood occasionally, and Dean would take him around, show him the sights, introduce him to people in the industry. But more importantly, Dean made sure that Frank felt like he was part of the journey. When Dean's career took off, Frank was there to celebrate with him. When times were difficult, Frank was there to remind Dean of who he really was. Their reunion that night became the beginning of a renewed family connection that would last for the rest of their lives. The stranger who stood up in the Coconut Grove wasn't a threat or a rival or someone from Dean's past trying to cause trouble. He was a reminder. He was a mirror. He was family, showing up at exactly the right moment to show Dean Martin that success is meaningless if it means losing sight of where you came from. And Dean Martin, being the intelligent and emotionally aware person he was, understood this immediately. He understood that the most important performance he could ever give wasn't necessarily the one on stage in front of thousands of people. It was the performance of staying true to himself, of honoring his heritage, of keeping his family close even as he reached for the stars. That night changed Dean Martin. It made him more human. It made him more real. It made him understand that beneath the stage name and the Hollywood glamour was still Dino Crocetti, and that Dino Crocetti was worth something too. When people talk about Dean Martin's legacy today, they talk about his contributions to entertainment, about his talent as a performer, about the impact he had on Hollywood and on American culture, but those who knew him best understood that his greatest legacy was his ability to stay connected to his humanity, to his family, to his roots. And that ability began on a night in October 1952, when a stranger stood up in a nightclub, and Dean Martin was shocked to discover he was looking at his own past, his own family, a mirror of where he came from. The microphone that Dean handed to his cousin Frank that night became, in its own way, a symbol of something profound. It was Dean saying to Frank, to his family, to his own past, "You matter. You are seen. You are heard. You belong here with me, on this stage, in this moment." And that simple act of recognition, that simple gesture of inclusion, changed both men forever. It reminded them that success isn't something you achieve alone. It's something you achieve while staying connected to the people who believed in you before you became successful, who saw potential in you when you were just a skinny kid singing in an Italian-American neighborhood, who loved you not because of what you accomplished, but because of who you are.